Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm Clay Shirky. I teach over at the Interactive Telecommunications program and at Journalism, and it is my enormous pleasure to introduce Andrew Zolli today. I first met Andrew in the middle of the 1990s at a digital salon for people who were building websites, which was a new thing back in those days. And it was apparent even then that Andrew was interested in approximately everything, and that his real skill was finding conversations that were happening among one group of people that should also be happening among another group of people. What can digital designers say to doctors? What can doctors say to digital designers? And he's gotten himself in the business of brokering those conversations in a really amazing environment. His title is the Executive Director of PopTech. His role is Curator-in-Chief. PopTech, 16 years old this year, is a conference series and now a social entrepreneurship lab, which does really amazing work, a lot of which I think you will hear about as he explores this idea of resilience. Andrew's been working for 3 years on taking particularly the concept of resilience and explaining it concretely and at length. The easiest way that I've found to kind of envision resilience is looking at radio towers. The taller they get, the bigger their bases get. You'll see them by the side of the road up until at a certain point, the bases get really small. And they get very thin, and they have guy wires instead holding them to the ground. And that's the moment where the radio tower goes from being robust, which is to say engineered to resist the wind, to being resilient. It bends with the wind and then snaps back. Because past a certain scale, you can't engineer a system to just resist the forces playing on it. And what Andrew is looking at, what resilience in a way means, is to try and get this idea to explain why this idea matters to systems in the modern world. Systems which are large, systems which are complex, systems which have to bend and then bend back with the forces bearing down on them. So let me bring up Andrew, who's here to talk to us about resilience, the idea, and the book. Congratulations, and come on up.
Thank you, Clay.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. Hi there. How y'all doing tonight? Good. Great. I am totally excited. You are my favorite people who showed up tonight, I want to tell you. All of these empty seats, assholes, all of them, just everyone. Anyway, I am totally thrilled to be here with you, and I just want to say it's a great pleasure to be introduced and an honor to be introduced by Clay, and I really want to thank Marcia Stepanek and Gabe and the whole team here at NYU. It's a really genuine pleasure and an honor to be with you talking about this, and I will share with you that the things I'm going to be talking with you about this evening are the very first time I have been talking about this work in public ever. So I've been working for the last 3 years on a big project going from the coral reefs of Palau to the backstreets of Palestine with a co-author and a team of research assistants, looking at the emerging heuristics and rules of thumb, the patterns of resilient systems in economic, ecological, technological, social, and other terms, and trying to deduce the kind of emerging new rule sets for how resilience works. And it's an incredibly important topic, I think, for right now. So I just want to, today what I'm going to do over the course of the next hour or so is take you on a tour. Literally, we're going to go all over the world, and we're going to look at lots of different contexts and try to deduce some of these principles together and think about what they mean for the design of systems and the creation of interventions and a new way of thinking about making change in the world and a new way of thinking about being in the world. Just by quick introduction, because I think many of you don't know very much about me, I'll just tell you a couple of quick things about myself. I am incredibly honored to run this organization with my colleague Letha Filderman, who's sitting out there, who's the president of the organization, and a few of my team members are here too. This organization, PopTech, we bring together an extraordinary network of scientists and technologists and engineers and designers and corporate and social sector leaders and ecological innovators and people working at the forefront of fields that are so new that all we can call them are uncategorizable weirdos. And we try to facilitate that network working together on new approaches to some of the world's toughest and most intractable challenges. In addition to that, I also serve as one of the explorers at the National Geographic Society. I'm part of their Big and Tall program, where they fit fat men into submarines and send them to the bottom of the ocean. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called Chubby Cousteau. And in addition to that, as Clay mentioned, I just finished working on this big book on resilience, which will be out in July, and so which really is the culmination and really the beginning of a much larger project to look at the dynamics of resilient systems. I would encourage you, if you get a chance, just go to poptech.org if you're interested in these subjects. We're producing all kinds of really remarkable content and ideas and insights. You can hear from extraordinary thinkers and leaders and doers on this subject, not least among them Clay himself, thinking about these ideas. So here we are. Where are we right now? You know, at the end of the 20th century, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of the global network, the pontificators and forecasters of the day thought that essentially the era of conflict and strife and disruption was largely winding down. We saw books with titles like The End of History. And then we saw a decade that started here in this city with an act of extraordinary disruption and ended with a global economic disruption. You know, a period of just incredible disruption of every kind. And all of us have been getting used to living in that kind of world. And I can give you a really good example of what it feels like to live in that kind of world. It's not a world of Kansas, and it's not the world of Oz. It's really the world in between. We are in the whirlwind. We are in an in-between place, a time when the multiplicity, speed, dimensionality, and interconnectedness of the forces that are acting on us from all over the world has created a world that's very hard to see through. A world in which it's very hard to forecast about what comes next. And you can see it in the way we actually digest the news of volatility. This is what the front page of the New York Times looked like on September 30th, 2008, when the global financial crisis first hit. What I'd like to call your attention to is none of the specific facts about what's up here on the screen, but rather pay attention to the fact that if you were a reader of the newspaper on that day, looking at massive gyrations not seen since the Great Depression, roiling the global financial markets, it took up 100% of our real estate. Our psychic real estate was completely focused on one story. Now flash forward, just 2 or 3 years later, 2.5 years later, we have a huge debt crisis, a political crisis about whether or not the U.S. will default on its debts. There is another huge series of gyrations in the global financial markets. The Dow and the NASDAQ spin wildly out of control. And on that day, August 9th, 2011, we spent only about half of our screen real estate on this huge, equally disturbing and scary moment where we weren't sure we could actually get our act together and keep the nation afloat. Now look ahead again to the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Literally the anniversary, a period of time in which the markets had just gone through yet another period of huge gyration and volatility. And that story of that volatility merited just one column inch. And you can see the story of volatility essentially normalizing for all of us. We have come into an age in which volatility is the new normal. And that's a frightening, bracing, exhilarating, difficult, challenging, interesting place to live in, right? That is a complex moment for all of us to live through, in which it's hard to know exactly what we might be doing, not just 10 years from now, but 2 years from now. And that story is mirrored in many other domains of human and ecological existence. For example, here's a picture of the growth of humanity's footprint on planet Earth. This is from 4.5 billion people to 7 billion people over the course of the last 30 years or so, from 1980 through today. And here's what I'd like to call your attention to. Here's what happened in the world of oil prices. And here's what happened in the world of wheat prices, and here's what happened in the world of cotton prices, and here is the mean temperature anomaly that we are experiencing as a result of global climate change. And the part of the graph I'd like you to pay attention to is this one. This is a messy, scary, complicated, difficult, weird place to live. This is not global warming, it's global weirding, right? Lots of up and down screeching. A pattern that reflects nothing more similarly than the brainwave of epileptics during a seizure. Now, that's all abstract. What does that stuff mean for real people? Well, I want to just tell you one really quick story just to show you about how these systems are connected to one another and what those connections mean for real people. In January of 2008, 70,000 people massed in the central square of Mexico City, and they rioted for several days. And they held above their heads not weapons, but ears of corn. These were what became known as the tortilla riots, a major food riot in Mexico City. The reason they happened had nothing to do with greedy landowners or ranchers as the immediate proximate cause. The real reason that, though none of them knew it at the time, the real reason that they were having their riots that day had to do with an event that had happened 3 years before, or sorry, a little bit longer than that, but about 3 years before, in 2005, when Katrina hit the Gulf Coast of the United States. And when Katrina was making landfall, the domestic energy system in the United States basically shut down. The 2,900 refineries that dot the coast of the United States basically stopped working. And almost overnight, in some places, the price of gasoline went up by 40 or 50%. And that made the price of ethanol look really cheap by comparison. Ethanol, the stuff that's made with corn, this stuff. And so there was a huge effort to divert the United States corn crop into ethanol production. In fact, the next year, Congress got in on the act and mandated a five-fold increase in ethanol production, with 40% of it to come from the Corn Manufacturers Association. A huge gift to agribusiness in the center of the United States. And what that did was divert farmers who were growing their crops for human consumption to non-edible energy production. And in an era of NAFTA, what that did was two things. One is it squeezed local food manufacturing in Mexico among the campesinos. That did something else really important, which is it began to yoke the price of corn to the price of oil. The price of food and the price of energy began to move in lockstep. Here is what the two price curves for corn on the top green and oil on the bottom blue. And if you look at what happened, these are two curves that moved basically independently of each other for a long time until until very recently, when suddenly they started moving in lockstep. And then when there was a speculative bubble in the oil markets, the price of corn went up as well. So we allow international unregulated speculation in the corn markets, in the energy markets, people who are not thinking about, who are betting on what the price of a barrel of oil might be 2 years from now, driving the price up, not realizing they're also driving up the price of food. And what does that do? It turns into this. It turns into real political stress and real hunger issues. Among people where 40% of the population is living below the poverty line, in a matter of 4 weeks, the price of corn basically went up by 400%. So imagine if you went to the grocery store and your bill was 4 times larger for your basic food staples than it was a month ago. You'd be rioting too. Now, the thing I want to tell you about this world is that this world is a repudiation of foresight. It's a repudiation of the act of futurism. It makes thinking about the future virtually impossible. Anybody who is thinking about the future, of all of those folks who were making professional prognostications, none of those folks were thinking, when we were experiencing Katrina, that 3 years later we were going to have food riots in Mexico City as a result of a hurricane. Everybody was focused in other areas. The speed, sources, severity, interconnectivity of the systems that govern our lives and the potential sources of disruption have multiplied really dramatically. Now, there's another problem here too, and that is that it's the problem of overconfidence, that we can't help but thinking about the future, and when we do, we bring to the entire exercise a really faulty set of equipment, namely the piece of equipment between our ears. And I can demonstrate this really easily. This is two images of what people thought at the the beginning of the 20th century that life was going to look like at the beginning of the 21st century. I'm sure you all recognize your house in this picture. As you can see, people thought over on the left that we'd be living in giant electrical transformers, and over on the right that we'd be rolling our whole town over to grandma's house in one of the most schizophrenic relationships with the natural world you can possibly imagine. But they did get the tagline right. I don't know if you can see that up on the upper side, upper right side. It says, "Trade your trouble for a bubble." We did that, but basically nothing else. So why is it that people at the beginning of the 20th century, when looking a century ahead, got our images so wrong? Why do we always get our images of the future wrong? Seemingly. Well, a big part of the reason has to do with an innate cognitive bias called the novelty bias that's actually reflected in these images. When we make images of the future, one of the things we do is we take the newest fact, the thing that's just happened, and we make it the dominant fact in our image of the future. So what was just going on right about then was the electrification of the home and the rise of mass transportation. So what was the future going to look like? We were all going to be living at the electrical station, and we were all going to be moving around in incredible ways. Right? We were taking our images of the future to their logical extreme. And I can give you an even better example of this. In 1977, there were exactly 4 members of the International Brotherhood of Professional Elvis Impersonators. Now, it takes a certain gonadal circumference, let's say, to call yourself the international anything when you have 4 members and they all live on the same block of Las Vegas. But with a lot of hard work, chaptering efforts, outreach, today there are more than 35,000 male and female, give it up for the sisters. Male, yeah, whoop whoop, I see a little whoop whoop back there. Male and female members of the International Union of Professional Elvis Impersonators. And at this rate, by 2050, 1 in 3 people on Earth is going to be an Elvis impersonator. So get ready, this is clearly the future. ITP has to be completely reorganized. All of this media invention stuff has got to go. Now, there are other errors we make when we think about the future as well, and I want to show you one really simple one here. Here's a simple test. Okay, I'm going to show you this image. It's going to blink back and forth, and what I want to tell you about this image is that there's only one thing different between the 2 images. Okay, and here's the test. It's very simple. It's a picture of people getting on an airplane. What I want to tell you is this. When you see the difference, do not say anything, but just merely, if you would, just quietly raise your hand. Okay? We're going to do this together. You ready? Here we go. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Okay. It's been about 30 seconds, so now I'd like to stop. Everyone who raised their hands on our system, raise them again. I'd like you to look around. About 15% of the room. Everyone who hasn't seen it, raise your hands if you wouldn't mind. About 85% of the room. Okay? Y'all got that? Okay, so let's look one more time, and I'd like you to pay very careful attention to the thing holding up the plane in the sky. We missed the thing holding up the plane in the sky. By the way, I was one of the 85%, by the way, the first time that I saw this, so I'm not holding myself above anybody else here. It's because our brain is biased to look specifically at certain kinds of patterns and basically to ignore others. The cognitive cost of analyzing complex scenes and analyzing for difference is so high that we naturally gravitate to the things that we pay attention to every single day. Our brains are designed to look at patterns in people, for instance, so our brains naturally go to what are the differences between the people getting on the plane. We don't even pay attention to the stuff that's in the background. And that has a real cost. And I can show you a really simple example of that. A few years ago, the folks at the Rand Corporation did a study of two major risks that we face as a civilization. The risk of terrorism and the risk of climate change. Over here we have the bad dude risk on the left. On the right, what we have is the disappearance of the largest glacier in Patagonia inside of a single human lifetime, about 75 years. Now, according to the folks at the Rand Corporation, your individual health risk, everybody's health risk, your chances of being personally affected by the activities of these two risks, the actions of these two risks. The risk of terrorism, about 1 in 28 million, roughly the same as winning the Powerball lottery. And we spend trillions of dollars to go after that risk, and I'm not arguing that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's a fact. We spend lots and lots of time and effort and money to go after those. Your chances of being affected by the climate change risk in your person, in your lifetime, for everybody in this room, about 1 in 6. That is 1/6 of the people in this room will have their lives shortened by climate change. Seriously shortened. Will not live as long as a result of this particular change in all of its manifestations. And yet we spend virtually nothing. Why is that? Well, in many ways, it's a manifestation of the same thing we just saw with the jet engine. We're really, really good at paying attention to threats that we think are embodied, fast-moving, have a face, are personified. Very bad at thinking about risks that are slow-moving, abstract, non-personified, don't break a moral taboo, and most importantly, don't have a story attached to them, don't have a singular narrative that coheres with our moral sensibilities. And so you have the situation that you have now. And finally, these sorts of changes, I'll just show you, have a real implication for how we see risks that are not so abstract, but ones that affect us even in the city of New York. This is work that was pointed out to me by Dan Ariely, a fantastic behavioral economist down at Duke University. He asked a whole bunch of different kinds of people, how do you think income is skewed by quintiles? How much do you think the top 20, of the total pie, how much do you think the top 20% in America makes? And how much do you think the next 20% makes? And how much do you think the next 20% makes? All the way down to the bottom 20%. And this is how a wide variety of people answered the question. People under $50,000 and people who made about $50,000 to $100,000 answered the questions almost exactly the same. People who made $100,000, over $100,000, thought that people who were in the top made a little bit more. Bush voters and Kerry voters, people who are Democrats, and this was during the Bush-Kerry election, Democrats thought that the people in the top kept a little bit more, but everybody thought that the top kept more than half. The top 20% had more than half of the wealth pie. How much of the total wealth do they own? Interestingly, when you ask people what should the ideal distribution be? How much wealth should everybody actually get? Everybody said the top should get less. Not necessarily proportional, but they should get less. So that, for instance, you asked people how much should the top keep? Nobody said 20%. And men said that the top 20% should keep more than women, and Republicans said that they should keep more than Democrats, many things that you might think naturally fall out of our natural political proclivities. Women thought that the top 20% should keep less than men, and on and on. Interestingly, the actual distribution for wealth in the country is like this. That is to say, the top 20% keeps about 80%, and the bottom 20% cannot be drawn on the graph. You can't actually see the bottom 20% in terms of their total percentage of the wealth of the country owned. They are invisible to us in the way that climate change is invisible to us, right? A slow-moving abstraction that we constantly overemphasize. Okay. So what do we do as a result of this? We are in a situation of enormous volatility in which our ability to see ahead is radically eclipsed, in which we can't even see necessarily the forces that are acting on us. How can we plan? Well, the reason that, I'm sorry, I thought I heard an eagle. I was like, and then, you know, the eagle spoke, and it gave us the answer. Well, because of all of this circumstance that we are in, is really the reason why I think increasingly we're going to spend more and more time talking about resilience. If you cannot control the tides of change, you have to increasingly focus on building better boats. And what do we mean by building better boats? We mean building systems that are able to maintain their core purpose with integrity amid the widest variety of circumstances and disruptions. Resilience will increasingly be an agenda for innovation. It will increasingly be a complement, if not a replacement, to much of our language around sustainability. There is a deep, profound, and broad revolution at work right now, and we see it in many different areas. So we've been spending time with big multinational corporations and frontline ecologists and social scientists and social innovators and governments around the world, and they're all coming to the same conclusion, which is that we need to prepare for a world, we need to prepare our institutions, our communities, our ecosystems, and ourselves for a world of intrinsic and sustained volatility and disruption for years to come. Now, broadly speaking, within the world of people who study resilience, there are two groups. There's a group of people who study systems, big abstract systems like economies and the internet. Those are systems that are not mediated every day by individual human decisions, and ones that people who are thinking about the resilience of people, like you and me, and communities and families and organizations and the like. The people who are working on the systems side have identified an emerging toolkit of tight feedback loops and the ability to decouple from bottlenecked resources and ensuring a kind of systemic internal diversity of strategies so that systems don't become overly reliant on a single mode of operation or production or value creation. A certain modularity and localism, the use of networks and increased interoperability, a heavy reliance, as you'll see, on data and better optics about what's actually going on within a system. So the systems world is filled with people who are thinking increasingly about these tools and these strategies as ways of bolstering the resilience of these large and abstract systems. And on the other side, what we see is a group of people who are thinking about the resilience of individuals, and they're thinking about things like mindfulness and belief states and the strength of social networks and communities, the ways in which we foster cooperation across differences. New forms of leadership, in particular around translational leadership. Really importantly, you'll notice that diversity is on the same, it appears on both sides of the chart. There are strategies that go across, and increasingly these two worlds, the world of people who think about the resilience of individuals and communities and social systems, and the people who think about the resilience of ecosystems, companies, economies, and the like, are going to converge, and they're in the process of converging now. Importantly, a few things about what resilience isn't. You heard Clay mention this earlier. Resilience is not robustness. The wonderful pyramids of Egypt are incredibly robust structures, but if you knock them over, they will not put themselves back together again. And there's something important about resilience in that ability to reconfigure in the midst of disruption. Similarly, it's not redundancy. Carrying around an extra system is really valuable. Like, it's great if to have a spare tire. If you've ever been on a lonesome road late at night, very important to have a spare, right? We always carry, on the space shuttle, they carry 2 of everything. But in the everyday world of regular concerns, it can be hard to carry around extra systems. Businesses are under constant pressure to return any excess profits back to their shareholders. Why should you keep all of that extra material? Why should you keep a redundant system? In fact, it's also not reserves. It's not having lots of wealth. Wealth helps, right? Having resources helps. Being redundant helps. And being robust helps. But they're not exactly the same thing as resilience. Really, what we mean by resilience is 2 things. First, you can think about a system as occupying a kind of landscape of hills and valleys. Each valley is a kind of niche in a landscape of possibility, each hill being a kind of critical threshold that separates one circumstance from the next. Well, a resilient system is able first to resist being pushed past a critical threshold and into an adjacent space. It has systems that are designed to keep it within its natural system. So if it's perturbed, it doesn't actually fall over. That's continuity in the face of change. And the second is to make sure that if you are knocked over into a different circumstance, that you either can get back up again or continue to function with integrity. So it's the ability to both resist being pushed past the threshold and ensure that if you land in a different circumstance that you'll be able to continue to do what you need to do in the world. And maybe a good way to think about this and its relationship to sustainability is to imagine a truck. Let's take a big vehicle and we'll take a big global challenge that everybody thinks about all the time. Let's take climate change, for instance. And let's take all the people who care about climate change, who want to make a really significant shift in the way that the planet manages the carbon loading of the atmosphere and manages the ecological concern of climate change. And let's put them in that truck, and then let's send that truck headed toward a cliff, the giant cliff of irrevocable environmental catastrophe. Now, in the early stages of sending that car toward that cliff, a certain group of people come to prominence in that conversation. Those are folks who believe in risk mitigation. They say things like this: stop, turn around, do not build another coal-fired power plant, right? We need to come into some kind of equilibrium with the cliff so that we don't go over. We're in danger of being annihilated. But as the car continues toward the cliff, and comes to a place where even if they hit the brakes, maybe the car's going to keep going over. That is to say, this situation, as evidenced by my world-class PowerPoint skills, a different group of people comes to prominence. And those folks are folks who believe in risk adaptation. And they say things like, hey, we'd better put some airbags and a parachute on this thing because it's going over, and there are some vulnerable people in the car who may be killed by the crash. Now, these folks back here, when they say stop, turn around, we're headed in a terrible direction, they're right. And it's the moral and appropriate thing to say in the face of a major risk, to say, hey, we're headed toward a cliff, we had better stop, we had better change the system that is leading us over this cliff. Similarly, when you get here, saying we had better put an airbag and some parachutes on this thing is also the moral and appropriate thing to say in the face of a big disruptive change. And somewhere between the two places, there is often a fight and a shift from those people who believe in risk mitigation to risk adaptation. And the mitigationists early on say to the adaptationists, well, look, if you put an airbag and a parachute on this car back here, then you will just encourage us to drive nearer to the cliff. You will just give a pass to the oil companies or a pass to the coal companies if you build a system that can absorb the disruption of their malfeasance. This is within the rhetoric of that movement. Similarly, later in the game, the folks who are mitigationists say to the adaptationists, well, every day you stand in front of history and say, stop, is a day that we're not actually building the systems we need to make sure that the most vulnerable among us survive. And the point is, in this argument, they're all right. They're all correct. But nothing changes the truth of the cliff. And that's the point of the circumstance we're living in. The era of volatility we're in is an era of cliffs, sudden, disruptive, non-linear, non-predictive moments of change. Big, great recessions, big ecological catastrophes. It's an era of Fukushimas. It's an era of great recessions, of global financial crises. That's the world in which we have to build a lot of value. Okay, so are you all bummed out? I hid all the silverware, all the sharp implements have been taken out from under your chairs. There'll be no wrist slitting during this presentation. So I want to talk with you just for a moment or two about about how we think about fragilities in systems and where they come from. In order to do that, I want to give you a metaphor to think about. Imagine that sometime during this presentation, a lawyer comes running in the room and taps you on the shoulder and says, "I'm a lawyer for your great uncle Pete. He's a tree farmer in the Pacific Northwest, and he died. You had no idea he was even in existence. But he died, and he left you a beautiful tree farm out in the Pacific Northwest that's yours for the taking. The only thing is his will stipulates that if you are the recipient of this, you have to actually go and try to make a going concern of this tree farm." So you say, "Hey, you know, NYU is great, but I really love the outdoors, and you know, I love I don't know, lycra sweaters and things they wear in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm headed out there. I'm going to make a go of it, right?" So now you are confronted with this plot of land, and you have a couple of strategies that you might follow to figure out how to get the best yield out of this land. Now, one strategy you might follow is to do something like this: to plant a bunch of trees at wide but regular intervals so that none of the canopies touch. And this is an important strategy for mitigating the risk associated with your tree farm, because if a lightning strike lights one of your trees on fire, because the canopies don't touch, it's unlikely that the fire will spread. But this is a very conservative strategy. You're not getting the most use out of your land. So being a little more risk tolerant, you might go in and put in a few trees in between those trees, and in the process creating something like a little cluster where all the canopies of the trees touch. Now, if a lightning strike hits any one of those trees, the whole cluster is going to go up, but not all your trees. And eventually, if you keep planting trees, eventually when you plant about 60% of the land, you'll have created one dense mega cluster. And that mega cluster is extremely efficient in terms of use of your land and extremely fragile to the risk of forest fires. Now, that's a really important thing I want you to remember in your head. What we've yoked together is efficiency and fragility. The moment when we get the most value out of a system is often when it is in its moment of greatest peril, even if that peril is not immediately obvious. Now, you're smarter than this. You're not going to do this strategy. Instead, you're going to use roads. You're going to go in and build a compensatory system that carves up your tree forest, your little tree farm here, into groves so that you can drive in and pull the wood out. And these roads will act as fire breaks. And eventually, with a lot of iteration, trial and error, eventually you will come up with a model of roads that compensate for the wind and the weather and the kind of trees you're planting and the likelihood of lightning strikes. And eventually you will come up with a system that is perfectly balanced, that gives you regular, solid returns and is unlikely to completely burn down if there's a forest fire which you can't control. And you will say to yourself, this is great. I am cashing out. I'm going back to NYU and they're going to name a building after me. Okay, everything is golden. And just about then, that is usually the day when you discover that on a trip to a conference to meet some foreign suppliers, one of these little creatures hitchhiked its way on your boot back into your forest and used your perfectly placed roads to go in and infest your entire forest and ruin your crop. Now, the thing I want to show you there is something very important, and that's this. Remember, at one end, we had efficient, but very fragile systems, really densely planted forests. At the other hand, we had really robust but very inefficient plantings that were very conservative. And in the middle, we built complexity. We built compensatory systems to balance the two. And eventually, the complexity of those systems can grow to where it becomes a source of instability itself. The complexity of systems grows as an effort to balance the inefficiency and the robustness, the fragility, and the yield. And the thing that's interesting about this term, there's a term for systems like this, they're called robust yet fragile systems, is that robust yet fragile systems are everywhere. And it is the hallmark of robust yet fragile systems that they are very good at dealing with intended problems, problems they were designed to deal with, in this case the risk of forest fires, and they fail utterly in the face of unanticipated risks, risks that nobody really thought about when we designed the system. There's no such thing as a graceful failure for these kinds of systems, and it turns out that your body is a robust yet fragile system. Your metabolism was largely designed, and if you think about the compensatory systems that your body uses, things like inflammation, think about the illnesses of today, cancer, inflammatory diseases, diabetes. They're all perversions of the control systems of an ancestor that we used to have, a Neanderthal ancestor, who used to have a diet that looked very different than the thermonuclear calorie delivery system that we have developed, the tactical, engineered, synthetic sugar, fat, and salt delivery system that is a Dorito. Right? Is there anybody in this room that doesn't like Doritos? Okay? I just want you to know that only about 2% of the hands went up. Okay? That is because your ancestors craved salt, fat, and sugar. They were rarities. And so your brain has a shortcut. It completely shortcuts your reason. In the face of salt, fat, and sugar, you will take it. You will actually hit another person over the head with a rock to get it. And you will furiously protect it. And the reason you do that is because they were keys to our survival, but not today. Today, the very things that were keys to our survival 40,000 years ago are killing us, right? And I can tell you that if we had an international war on cheeseburgers, I would have to move to Canada, okay? I'm just as bad as everybody else, as I believe is evident. So here's the story I want to tell you about this. It turns out that increasingly, we're learning how to deal with these robust yet fragile systems by looking at design principles that come from the natural world. And I don't mean biomimetic principles. I mean something much deeper. Coral reef systems, for instance, deeply illustrate how to deal with these shocks and unanticipated shocks. And rather than tell you this story, I'm going to fast forward because I want to make sure that we get through to the end and have time for questions. But we spent, in the time where we were researching this book, a lot of time with folks who were working in the very inner sanctum of global financial regulatory systems, the people who are managing the global economy. And you know who they're spending most of their time talking to these days are systems ecologists who look at coral reef systems. Because it turns out that the global financial system and a coral reef are very similar, complex systems. They have very similar dynamics. And increasingly, people who are systems ecologists have things to say about the way the financial system is regulated. I'll give you just one example of that. This is work that was done by an ecologist named David Bellwood. Coral reefs have two states that they are dominated, that are dominant for a coral reef. One is this kind of thing that you'd love to see, walking around a beautiful coral reef where you love to go scuba diving, you'd love to swim around this stuff. Totally beautiful. And the other is a reef system that looks like this. It's covered in algae. And the way that the coral reef protects itself from becoming dominated by algae, because a little bit of algae is a good thing, the fish eat it, but too much algae kills the reef, is this species over here, the parrotfish. You might have seen these things if you've ever gone scuba diving. Basically are the lawnmowers of the reef. They keep the reef in check. And most of the time, they do a perfectly fine job of that unless the system begins to tilt very radically into a different circumstance. And at that point, interestingly, a group of ecologists have just discovered this other little fish over here called a pinnate batfish changes its behavior and goes from eating corals to eating these long-form algae. It's called a sleeper functional group. It's basically an insurance policy that the reef keeps against being tipped past a critical threshold. So a group of species change their behavior in real time in the presence of a threat. They completely reorganize and do things that they don't normally do when the reef is healthy to take advantage, to keep the reef within its protected natural niche, within its healthy dominated state. The ecologists pointed out in their work with the global financial regulators that there are analogs of this within the financial system, and one of the best analogs of this little batfish, this little yellow and black fish that I just showed you, is something called the Veer. The Veer is an alternative currency that's ubiquitously used in Switzerland. It's a complementary currency to the euro and previously to the Swiss franc. It was designed during the Great Depression when there was a liquidity crisis and people couldn't get access to cash. The banks were basically closed down. Businesses came together and they created basically a form of bartered exchange, a new denomination called a Veer. And today, to this day, whenever there's a financial crisis within Switzerland and money becomes tight, trade shifts commensurately over to this alternative form of currency. And this is not a form of currency that's used by people who use the bills to roll very awesome cigarettes and smoke them and pass them around. This is used by very serious business leaders. This is used by real institutions to manage crises when there are liquidity crises in the system. And this is exactly like the batfish. It's an insurance policy that's built into the system. So I'm going to take you through a series of these strategies in the balance of our time today. The next one I want to talk to you about is about decoupling, which is a broad strategy for identifying things that are core bottlenecks in the environment in which we live in, things that are under serious systemic risk, and working with especially new technologies to decouple from those dependencies. And this story begins really with this amazing observation. Has anyone here ever been in a Walmart? Okay, everybody here should go to a Walmart once in your life. You know, it's a massively underrated experience. It's truly astounding. My favorite Walmart experience ever was to discover that I could buy 4 of these items for $1. $1. I could buy 4 t-shirts, 4 items of clothing, 4 garments that I could wear forever, if you're me. But maybe that's an overshare. For basically less than half of the cost of a subway ride in New York City. What we learned from the folks at Nike is that it takes, anyone have any guess how much water it takes to make one of these t-shirts? Yeah. It takes 700 gallons to make a single organic cotton t-shirt, 1 t-shirt. So when you buy 4 t-shirts for $1, what you're buying is 2,800 gallons worth of virtual water that is delivered. That is independent of the carbon loading of the atmosphere. It's independent of all of those other implications associated with the manufacture, production, distribution of that product. So what's fascinating is to look at garments like this one. This is a new dyeing technology that is a waterless dyeing technology. It's a closed-loop, CO2-based waterless dyeing technology. It's built on systems that basically dip the shirts in dye capsules and then use highly pressurized CO2 to explode the capsules and highly pressurized to fuse them molecularly to the filaments in a garment in a closed-loop system that goes round and round and round. And Nike, a huge multinational corporation, has decided that it is in their strategic interest to not be in competition for water with other industries, with agriculture, and with other human beings, not to mention the broader natural world. We're going to see lots and lots of these kinds of technologies in the years to come. This is another example. This is one of the PopTech fellows, Eben Bayer, and what he's holding in his hand is an oil-free replacement for styrofoam. Some of you may know that styrofoam is among the most terrible and toxic materials. Not only is it made out of petroleum products and chemicals, but because recycling systems are largely based on weight, and most styrofoam packaging is designed because of air freight to be really, really light, it's virtually impossible to recycle. You could gather a room's worth of this material, a giant room like this worth of styrofoam, take it to a recycler and not get any money for it because it's based on the total volume. The mass, not the volume. So what Eben's work does is take this rootstock of mushrooms. You might have seen this. If you've ever walked around in the forest, you've seen the underlying You've kicked over a mushroom and you'll see this white material underneath the mushroom. That's mycelium. And what they do with this mycelium is in special factories they grow a packaging material which they then treat so that it's no longer degradable. It doesn't rot in its use. And it's mixed with locally available biomass. So the biomass that they mix it with in the Midwest, in Iowa, is corn husks. In a different part of the country, it's wheat stalks. In a different part of the country, it's timber byproducts. And they form it into packaging, which when you're done with it, you can throw it in your backyard and it will decompose back into dirt. And what they've done there is two really important things. They've decoupled the packaging system from the oil system in the same way that we saw one of the big problems was the coupling of the corn system and the oil system in the earlier example. But they've also created a system in which they can do local manufacture and variable manufacture. So this is a combination of both decoupling and localism. And my favorite example of this, something that all of you should check out, is something called the rep wrap. Some of you who are designers or who are industrial designers or who come from a product world will recognize that one of the most ubiquitous tools we use is something called a 3D printer. It's an object printer that allows you to prototype, a 3D prototyper. Well, this object is those 3D printers usually cost somewhere around $40,000. They're huge room-size objects that produce these usually polymer prototypes of everything we buy before it's a tool that designers use. This is a $400 open source replicator that you can make. And not only is it $400 instead of $40,000, but it's designed in such a way that it can make itself. Actually, it's a self-replicating replicator. There it is. That's the one on the left that actually made the one on the right. It actually looks like the guy on the left could be the father of the one who's over there on the right, but actually it's the two machines. So their basic premise is if you would like to unlock local manufacture, what you do is you just send one of these machines with an instruction to hit a button, and it makes enough copies of itself that you don't have to ship them anywhere. You just shipped one, and then it essentially leads to the rise of our robot overlords, but that's a different chapter of the conversation. So I'm taking you on a tour of this. I want to put aside those systemic, structural, material elements, many of which are very consilient with overall sustainability strategies, and talk with you now about some of the elements of resilience in a more human domain. And in order to do that, I want to tell you, and by the way, y'all still with me? You doing okay? Anyone here, if you need to pee, just go. It's fine. I'll understand completely. So what I want to tell you about is a story in order to talk to you about the sociology of resilience, the social side of resilience. I want to tell you about a story that begins 100 years ago at the dawn of the automobile age in Britain. And when the automobile came to Britain at the end of the Victorian era, sort of like right in the middle of the end of the Victorian era, it was fashionable at that time to have, and it still is in many parts of the country, to have very high privacy hedges. This was so that Lord Crustybottom did not have to upset you with the ability to see his vast wealth. So he would put it behind a very high shrub, basically. And if you've ever been to the English countryside, often around manor estates and sometimes around farms, you can see these very large 30-foot tall privacy hedges that look like this. And this was the dawn of the automobile age. There were no signs on the road. There were no rules of the road. And so as drivers started to drive on the road, they would drive along and get hurt because they couldn't see, like at an intersection, when a car was coming from a perpendicular direction, because they were basically driving down the center lane of the Death Star. You know, they were driving down this very high-walled environment. And so there was a movement in Britain actually to encourage people to tear down their privacy hedges so that drivers could see over them at intersections. And a letter appeared in the Times of London about that time from someone who tried this activity, and I'll paraphrase for you. He said, before any of your readers may be induced to cut down their hedges, they may like to know what happened to me when I did so. 4 years ago, I cut down the hedges and shrubs to a height of 4 feet, 30 years back from the dangerous crossing in my hamlet. What do you think happened as a result of my effort to make the whole situation safer? Well, what happened was basically two things. First of all, the following summer, my garden was covered with dust caused by fast-driven cars, and the accident rate of the passing cars was considerably increased. Why is this? Because people used the increased safety benefit of having lower hedges to drive faster. They basically compensated for the safety benefit and offset it, right, and started having the same number of accidents they had before. This is actually a phenomenon, a real phenomenon in the world of risk called risk compensation that's strongly related to something called risk homeostasis. You may recognize some similar phenomena on the road today in the United States. As we give people virtually invincible SUVs, they eat in them, listen to MP3s, text their friends, watch videos, often at the same time as they're getting dressed and, writing their thesis or what have you. And you could easily put a man in this. This is not a gendered point. So you recognize this story is happening when we see all around us. Two big stories from Europe in this regard. One studied the rise of anti-lock brakes in Amsterdam, and what was discovered was something really fascinating. When they put anti-lock brakes on taxi cabs, the accident rate for taxis with anti-lock brakes didn't change at all because the taxi drivers drove faster, drove closer, and broke later on the assumption that everything would be fine. And it was particularly bad, and has continued to be bad, for bicyclists. This is terrible for bicyclists. The rise of bicycle safety laws, in particular the rise of helmet laws, have had no considerable impact on the number of fatalities associated with bicyclists, not because it doesn't make bicyclists safer from accidents where you fall off your bike, but because it makes automobile drivers who drive around bicyclists who are wearing helmets think that the bicyclists are safer than they are, causing the cars to drive faster and basically clip them and kill them. So the bicycle helmet is a good thing for the cyclist. It's a terrible message for the driver who thinks, he'll probably be okay. And this led to something famous called Booth's Rule Number 2, which is by a famous skydiver. The safer skydiving gear becomes the more chances skydivers will take in order to keep the fatality rate constant, because that is the job of skydivers, to die at a predictable rate. And if you make it safer, people will engage in more dangerous activity. And we know what this looks like when you sum it to the level of culture, of an institution or an organization. It looks like BP. BP had one major accident every other year somewhere on Earth leading up to the big accident that they had in the Gulf, because they created a culture in which their risk tolerance was naturally set, their risk thermostat was set naturally very high. So how do we change this? If we want more resilient social systems, if we want more resilient people, more resilient communities, we got to figure out how to change the normative practices of communities around behaviors that are very, very risky. And the good news is that this is one of the places where the world of public health, for instance, is teaching us an enormous amount about how to tackle very unconventional problems. And the example I'd like to give you is that of an extraordinary program in Chicago called Ceasefire. It was started by an epidemiologist named Gary Slutkin, who did his work, field work, building the first very successful anti-HIV programs in Central Africa and Uganda, came back to the United States, to Chicago, and noticed that the outbreaks of gun violence on the south side of Chicago looked very similar to the epidemiological patterns of the illnesses he was charged with interdicting. And so he decided to treat the outbreak of gun violence not as if it were an illness, but as an actual illness, a mimetic illness. Now, when you're treating an actual illness, what you do is you identify those people who are super spreaders of the behavior you don't want. So in an HIV context, for instance, who are the people who are going to infect the largest number of people? They might be sex workers, as an example. If you can convince sex workers to use condoms, you can often dramatically cut the rate of HIV infection. It's a first line of attack on tackling a difficult normative behavioral problem. So what they do at Ceasefire is they train formerly incarcerated senior drug and gang street-level operatives. These are guys who have enormous street-level credibility to become violence interrupters. They basically are trained to map, detect, and interrupt the spread of violence at the street level. And here's the really powerful thing. By doing these three things, first, by interrupting the spread and challenging the spread of violence, the acts of violence, often when the guns are drawn but not yet pulled, the trigger's not yet pulled, by working intensively to change the mindsets of the people most at risk of transmitting this violence, and by working to change the community norms around the acceptability of violence, according to the Department of Justice, they lowered the violent crime rate by up to 75% in their first year of operation. That is amazing. That is genuinely amazing. And it's part of an increasing resilience toolkit that will be applied not just to public health issues like gun violence, but very far afield. Increasingly, we're also seeing other kinds of organizations adopt these kinds of strategies. In the context of researching the book, we spent a lot of time with an incredible organization called Red Team University out in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where the Army is training a professional corps of skeptics within the chain of command to challenge respectfully plans that are made on the battlefield, to challenge the premise, the presence and premise of groupthink, and to encourage a kind of cognitive diversity, a broader array of opinions among people who are forming action plans on the battlefield. The time we spent with them that was the most enjoyable was the time that they were spending watching scenes from The Godfather. They were watching this guy, Tom. He was the consigliere, do you remember? He's played by Robert Duvall. And they were, first of all, when you go to spend time in the military, what you discover is their process of natural selection. All the men and women are 6'4" and have shoulders like this and hips like this, right? They're all these yoked, huge men and women, and they're all spending time trying to understand how to deliver bad news to people up the chain, because that's actually what Robert Duvall's character had to do constantly. He had to communicate the truth in a way that didn't create outsized passions and get people riled up, but deliver challenging information in a way that really drove the conversation forward. Similarly, a group of research scientists, I won't spend time, too much time on this here, have discovered exactly the same pattern of cognitive diversity, ensuring that people who are working on problems are working on them from the widest variety of circumstances, has an enormous impact on the rate of success in research labs. Research labs where, say for instance, all of the researchers are E. coli researchers tend to interpret ambiguous results, new results, only in terms of prior E. coli findings, and they make very incremental progress. When you have teams that are very diverse, filled with physicists and chemists and doctors and people who come from a wide variety of backgrounds, they interpret the ambiguous results in a much more broad way, and they make progress much faster. So again, all of these are strategies to break up a kind of groupthink and to challenge norms. And one of the kind of critical things we're going to be doing in the resilience world for a long time to come is identifying norms that prevent this kind of cognitive diversity from taking hold. The next part of the social side of the story that I want to share with you, and this is one of the last two, is about translational leadership. This is a term we borrowed from translational medicine. And what we mean here is something I think really fascinating. Everywhere we went to look at resilience, when we found it in a social context, we found two things. We found healthy communities, and we found a certain kind of leader. And they weren't the leader at the top. They weren't the square-jawed visionary CEO type. And they weren't the person at the bottom. They weren't the young, passionate activist. They were often people who worked behind the scenes to weave new networks together. They were network weavers. They were responsible for bringing together constituencies that would not normally have worked together. And the easiest example I can give you of this is one from our own network. It's an organization called iTeach. It's run by a wonderful duo of women named Zini Tibete, who's a Zulu woman from KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, and an infectious disease doc from Harvard named Krista Dong. And Krista and Zini run an organization that works to amplify the effectiveness of HIV public health systems in rural South Africa. And it's important just to give you a little bit of context on this. They work in an environment where the HIV infection rate is about 40%. They're based at a hospital in rural South Africa that is an apartheid-era hospital that serves 1 million people. About 400,000 of those are HIV positive. Only 8,000 of them are in care, and for that entire population, there are only 3 physicians. So if you can imagine, that is a classic high-burden, low-resource setting, a classic environment of not having enough people to contend with the problem. This is actually what it looks like. It's made worse by many bizarre facts about the public health system in South Africa, including the fact that by government mandate, you have to give people 3 hours of training before you can give them any HIV medication, even if they are unconscious. So there's someone right off camera over here reading to these folks who are literally, they're not awake. They're just literally lying down asleep. This is what over here on the left-hand side, the intake ward looks like for the infectious disease ward. That's a person who's HIV positive sitting right behind someone who has tuberculosis, sitting right behind someone who's HIV positive. So you have people who have compromised immune systems sitting cheek by jowl with people who are incredibly infectious. So the whole system is really, really difficult. It's a very difficult environment, and it's made worse by misinformation, disinformation, and issues of stigma. Right across the hospital, these are 2 signs right across the hospital. One says basically, don't have sex. If you can, just abstain. But if you do have sex, the other one says, just take a shower and everything will be okay. And that was the government actually making that message for a long time. But the biggest story here is actually that there are 2 healthcare systems in South Africa. What you think of as the kind of white lab coat physicians, the traditional Western educated healthcare delivery system, and folks who go into hospitals and the doctors that treat them. And then there is an entirely other system for dealing with health problems that is a network of traditional healers. And 85% of South Africans see a traditional healer. A traditional healer, the most common form is called a sangoma. Traditional healers are, they practice an entirely different form of healthcare. That's an ancestor-based healthcare system. So if something's wrong with you, it's because your relationship with the ancestors may be out of whack. So do this particular ritual and things will work. And what happens is that these 2 systems, the traditional formal Western system and the traditional healthcare system and the formal Western system, were for years basically at odds with each other and not working together. Krista and Zini, because of the kinds of leaders they are, were able to reach out to the network of sangomas and build something incredibly powerful. The first network, really thriving and successful network, of traditional healer inpatient referral networks. Basically, they got the permission of the traditional healer network to say, look, when I'm treating someone, if it appears that they are HIV positive or appears they're TB positive, I'm going to be able to give them a slip and send them to the front of the line for treatment. To say, hey, I do ancestors, I don't do germs, and you look like you need to actually get into the formal system. The only way they were able to do that is because they bridged a deep divide with genuine authenticity. It's because of who they are, right? They themselves represent a cultural divide. They represent a traditional African and Western pairing, just in their own work together. And what they did is they spent enormous amounts of time building trust eating and building relationships with and listening to and spending time with and celebrating the work of the Sangomas until they were able to create the context of a deeply unified network. And today, what you see coming out of this network is something really extraordinary. What you see are field pathologists who are traditional healers who are doing the frontline work of Western medicine and acting as the sensor network for the Western system in ways that are very, very powerful. I'm going to leave you, I have just a few more minutes before we have time to open it for questions. I want to leave you with a couple of things about technology's role to play here. Many of you have been following, paying attention to, and thinking about the role of big data here, and the role of open data, and I'd like to spend a little time talking about it. One of the most powerful things we have now for the first time is a suite of tools that allow us to collect information that we never had access to before. We've come to a place where for the first time we can find out what people are doing with certain devices that just weren't we didn't have access to just a few years ago. The most obvious of these is the mobile phone. I want to mention two extraordinary things we can now do with mobile devices that I think change the game in ways big and small. The first is we can ask people how they're doing in contexts. So for example, what you see at the top here is a map of that was created by a team led by a guy named Nathan Eagle, who's a mobile technology expert. And Nathan built a system that allows he has 2 billion phone numbers, and what he can do is poll basically the entire planet. If he wants to find out anything about anything that's happening in almost any country in the world, he can ask something like 50,000 residents of that country and do head-to-head comparisons. So what you're seeing on the upper right quadrant here is actually what's happening right now. How are people feeling in their job search prospects in Nicaragua as reported via their mobile devices. This is instantaneous polling of the planet. That's a very powerful tool. But what's really exciting is what we can learn from that data that's non-obvious. And one of the things that these mobile technology leaders have discovered is that, for instance, the denomination with which someone tops up their mobile phone, in most places in the world, people buy credits and then spend them down. That's what someone is doing on the lower portion of the screen. When someone buys those credits, the denomination that they buy those credits in is a very good indication of their economic health. And if there's a sudden change in the denomination with which people buy credits, if they used to buy credits in $5 increments and suddenly buy credits in 50-cent increments, it's a very good early warning system to suggest that something economic has, some economic dislocation has happened. So if you suddenly see a whole bunch of people changing the denomination with which they top up their phone on a given Thursday in a particular community, you know that something may have gone very significantly wrong. So the speed with which we can generate insights is incredibly powerful. And that speed is given its apotheosis in the example I'm going to share with you right now. What I'm going to show you is a system called Epi-IQ. And while I'm going to run this video, I have to tell you about how it works. When there is an outbreak, like a public health outbreak, what the CDC does is they go into a hospital with a clicker. They go searching for patterns among cases to identify in the earliest stages where a particular outbreak might have happened. So this was an E. coli outbreak that happened in Germany, and what you're seeing is the European Centers for Disease Control and their map of how many cases they saw. In this case, this is thousands of cases, so 4,000 cases. There was a huge outbreak of reported incidents or data points around this particular E. coli outbreak. Now, this second map I'm going to show you is really fascinating. It's from a system called Epidemic-IQ, was built by an organization called the Global Viral Forecasting Initiative. And here's how it works. Rather than send people into hospitals with clickers to look for sick people, what they do is passively ingest into a big database 1 billion data points a day. Those billion data points are fed through an artificial intelligence machine learning algorithm that gets rid of 90% of them. then when that system has eliminated 90% of them, it takes the top 10% and it sends them to people who are playing Farmville on Facebook. And it offers players of Farmville the ability to earn 60 free seeds for their farms on Facebook if they can correctly identify whether or not this particular data point is about a health outbreak. And these data points are texts and news reports and blog postings and all kinds of social media data taken from all over the world. And that process of people playing on Farmville eliminates another 95% of them, and the last percentage are then sent to real experts. And here's the really powerful thing. Using this methodology of a combination of machine learning, crowdsourcing with virtual farmers on social media websites, and experts, they were able to identify the outbreak of E. coli in Germany 8 days faster than the CDC and 12 days faster than the World Health Organization. Right? That is an incredibly powerful tool. That is like in dealing with an epidemic, speed is everything. So to get a day is a big deal. To get 2 days is unreal. To get a week is unheard of. But to get 12 days faster data on the outbreak gives them the opportunity to hem and hedge against it in ways that are really powerful. So all of these tools that we're using, this combination of certain kinds of leadership, certain kinds of technology, certain kinds of structural patterns are all going to come together increasingly to help us build a more resilient set of platforms. So here's what I'm going to tell you. We're out of time, so because some of you, I think, have been waiting here, especially very quietly, I'm going to skip ahead just to say thank you. I'd love to have time for questions. And I just want to give you a couple of basic pieces of information. The first one is, that's my email address. I really do answer all my emails, so if you want to email me, go ahead. You can follow us on Twitter. Go check out PopTech. And if you'd like a free chapter, the first chapter of this book, we're actually going to make available for free. And it isn't out for 2 months yet, so you guys are the very first people to get this. Send an email to freechapter@andrewzolli.com, and we will send it to you right away. And I think we have time for questions, so thanks.
The disease outbreak thing you talked about was very interesting, but is it that much better than Google's search, where Google searches for people typing in, I have flu symptoms, and they can map the whole country? It seems like the Farmville and everything is it's very sophisticated, but it seems like Google comes up with a faster thing than that. Just your thoughts.
Yeah, what you're referring to is a platform that Google built, which was the inspiration for this one, called Flu Trends, where rather than what they tried to correlate were flu outbreaks based on people's searching patterns. So rather than send people into hospitals at flu season to count the number of people who come in with symptoms, just look for people who say, I have the sniffles, and can chicken soup really cure a cold? There's no question that by looking at that passive data, there's lots of things that you can learn. The thing that's interesting about it is that increasingly, a lot of that information just doesn't end up in the search engine. So what you end up with is people are texting their friend, hey, I think I have a cold, or I can't make it to the movies tonight because I'm feeling really sick. Right? So all of a sudden what we're doing is we're just expanding away from the formal web, which is the part that, that Google searches really, really well. Yeah.
Really fascinating discussion on decoupling technology and scale and localism about climate change. But I'm wondering very much about that portion of scale, because climate change is a global, non-boundaried issue. And how are you thinking, or how does this resiliency work in the context of the enormous scale of the issue?
That's a really good question. So I think the short answer is that much of this is about a shift in emphasis. It's a, you know, in many ways, the rise of resilience is a conservative idea. And it's conservative not in the political sense, but it's conservative in the kind of system sense. So imagine a taxonomy, if you will, that just like a little 4-part taxonomy, okay? So at this end of the spectrum, We have things that are in collapse, right? Here, over here we have systems and communities that are vulnerable. Over here we have systems that are resilient. And over here we have systems that are transformed, right? That are in a completely different context. Much of the resilience conversation is emerging because of two things. First of all, we've spent literally billions of dollars as a species, trillions of dollars at this point, taking people who were in who were living in systems of collapse. We're living in abject, sub $1 a day poverty. We developed these things called the Millennium Development Goals, where we pushed really, really hard to make progress against those Millennium Development Goals, and we managed to move people from a system of collapse into a period of resilience. But what we discover is that climate disruption threatens to completely undo all the progress that's been made, right? Similarly, systems that are resilient, what you really want are systems that are resilient, that can become temporarily vulnerable and return to their baseline state of resilience. What much of the conversation has been about for a long time has been about, well, why don't we need to fundamentally transform the system. All the conversation has been up here, right? We need to abolish the oil companies. We need to move to ubiquitous solar. We need to invent a new technology that powers all of human civilization. And those are wonderful dreams. Those are fantastic. But they were formed in an era when we weren't actually dealing with the day-to-day issues of all the volatility that is affecting people who are living over here in their day-to-day life. So there is a limit to adaptation. You can only adapt for so long before a system that is in collapse brings everybody down with it. Resilience isn't really a permanent solution. It's really designed to buy us time so that we can continue to work on transformation. But we're now at a point where we need the time. We actually need, we just at PopTech convened a lab in Kenya and rural East Africa on the intersection between climate resilience and gender. Because it turns out, this was news to me, and it may be news to you, that climate is a gender issue. Most of the world's smallholder farmers are women and girls. Most of the people who control the systems and manage the systems of water and agriculture and livestock are women and girls around the world. And yet most of our interventions that are aimed at climate adaptation are channeled through sections of the economy that are dominated by, or the society that are dominated by men. So what's happening is that some of the most vulnerable and most at-risk, marginalized community members are the ones who feel those effects disproportionately. Not everybody feels the effects the same way. The goal ultimately shouldn't be just to enable people who are vulnerable to remain vulnerable or resilient to become vulnerable, but we now need the time in order to continue to work toward transformation. Yeah.
So based on your research and your travels and writing this book, how do you personally approach issues and problems differently than you did before?
That's a really good question. Well, the part of my talk that I skipped was about personal resilience. I was going to end on that note, but we ran out of time. I think what I can say is this. There is a growing and jaw-dropping literature about personal resilience and about the psychosocial dynamics of resilient people and resilient groups and communities. Here in New York, there's an extraordinary thinker named George Bonanno. He's actually up at Columbia, who studies resilience at the population scale. And one of the things he discovered is that resilience is, as a psychological phenomenon, much more prominent than we had anticipated. It's not something that is rare, actually. A very large portion of humanity seems, without a lot of training, to be psychologically resilient to trauma. But for the people who aren't psychologically resilient to trauma, or who have greater vulnerability to traumatic events, psychic vulnerability to traumatic events, there is a growing body of literature about new habits and practices of mind that can amplify our personal resilience. And one of the areas where that work has been yielded the most fruit, and sort of surprising to someone who is fairly hard-nosed and scientific like me, was around mindfulness meditation practices. It was around mindfulness practices in general. There is extraordinary evidence to suggest that one of the ways in which we can bolster our personal resilience is by adopting mindfulness practices. And I don't have time to go into the whole narrative. I'm happy to talk about it over a drink. It's one important piece of a large cocktail of different things we can do. But one of the things that's changed about my life is that I've actually grown my personal practice in that regard as a way of contending with stress. Yeah. Thanks.
It was a pleasure to hear. I was curious about some of the development goals that are, such as the MDGs, and a lot of the innovation that's happening around how to meet those goals, and the risk that certain international groups are able to take, such as the oil companies or the development companies that have the resources from the Western world. And I was wondering if you thought there are good mechanisms to provide resources to the poor to innovate themselves and to take on risk to meet those goals themselves, rather than relying on external actors.
Well, one of those resilience principles is about localism. It's about the creation of systems that are designed at the community level. As you saw from this one example I used about the work of Ceasefire in Chicago, that is something, the design principle is with, not for. In the book, one of the things we tell is the story of the largest mass poisoning in history. It was an effort by a bunch of Western aid agencies, UNICEF and the World Bank, to build clean wells in Bangladesh in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And without properly testing for the presence of arsenic in those wells, they created a system where they poisoned about 10 million people and rising. And the arsenicosis is a terrible illness and has yielded incredible pain and suffering. It's inflicted tremendous pain and suffering on communities, and especially on the people who get sick with it. And the whole point about this is that it didn't have to be this way at all. It was a centrally planned, centrally imposed solution that was bureaucratically mediated, whereas systems like Ceasefire work primarily because they are completely and authentically integrated at the community level. They are in fact not imposed from without at all. They grow authentically from within. So I certainly think the locus of change where we see the greatest resilience is at the community level. And if there is a single kind of lesson that ties all of these pieces together, it's about this idea that was first popularized in the 1970s. And this is maybe a good place to stop, pee and drink. So basically fluid management is forthcoming for everybody. There was an idea that was popularized in the 1970s that we really see as being central to the whole resilience narrative, and that is the term adhocracy. Wherever we find resilience, we don't actually find single institutions, big organizations. We don't find monolithic structures at all. What we find are bits and pieces of shared technology platforms and social networks and individual change agents and parts of institutions and elements of government that work together in a kind of improvisational jazz structure. And the really fundamental question for all of us in building a resilient future is, how do we encourage jazz everywhere? How do we encourage organizational jazz, community jazz? How do we encourage creative personal jazz? It's the ability to not just to improvise, but to improvise collectively. And I really do think, and I'm not just saying this because I like Coltrane, I do think jazz may save civilization. And on that note, thanks very much.